In this first in a series of videos on Frankenstein, I'm going to explore the two main characters, Victor Frankenstein himself and the monster. Keen to develop a far more detailed insight into these fascinating characters, desperate to acquire and then learn some less obvious quotations for that wretched exam, or just interested in a fresh alternative perspective, stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
On my most recent reading of this classic novel, I was struck by how much I disliked Victor Frankenstein. In particular, on so many occasions, I found him horribly and repellently judgmental. For instance, on arrival in Ingolstadt, he cannot bring himself to hear Electra speak, largely due to feelings about his appearance and manner. He tells Walton in chapter 3 of volume 1, Monsieur Krempe was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. I could not consent to go and hear that little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of a pulpit. Now, this same Monsieur Krempe also gave Frankenstein a no-nonsense dressing down for spending so much time studying discredited alchemists, and you could argue that the latter's dislike may be triggered partially understandably by wounded pride. However, there is no explicit suggestion of this, and indeed Frankenstein himself tells Walton that he had long considered those authors useless whom the professor reprobated. Thus, the reader is simply left with an early impression of Frankenstein's arrogance, and with hindsight, fatal tendency to be swayed overwhelmingly by appearance rather than inner character. His metaphorical use of the term pulpit, rather than say lectern or even desk, implies that he feels Monsieur Krempe would preach pompously and dogmatically at his audience, with little or no allowances made for alternative perspectives. However, his earlier superfluous, in terms of judging his worth as a university professor, adjectives squat, gruff and repulsive confirm that, above all, young Frankenstein simply cannot stop himself reacting, judging, then dismissing virtually solely on appearance, thus foreshadowing his disgraceful abandonment of his creation. Another rather random example of Victor's repellently judgmental attitude towards others is seen in the latter stages of the novel in Volume 3, Chapter 4. He is in Ireland, in a prison, accused of the murder of Clerval. However, his illness has meant that any trial or further detailed questioning has had to be put on hold until he is fully recuperated. On finally awakening to coherent consciousness, he is greeted with a direct, no-nonsense speech from a hired nurse. Like virtually everyone else within the local community, her assumption is that he murdered Clerval. Note Victor's reaction. I turned with loathing from the woman who could utter so unfeeling a speech to a person just saved on the very edge of death. There are two words I would like to draw attention to here, loathing and saved. Doesn't the abstract noun loathing sum up Victor's unhelpfully, unnecessarily extreme reactions to people who are, in some way, different to him with different perspectives? In this case, she is clearly of a lower class. To feel loathing is not just to feel hatred, but strong disgust too. And note that this is towards someone who has nursed him back towards health and has done so successfully. Remember that whilst raving and delirious in prison, Frankenstein himself admitted that he called himself the murderer of William or Justine and of Clerval. Therefore, it is perfectly understandable if an onlooker has taken this at face value and referred directly to it. So, for Victor to react with loathing actually says far more about him and his narrow, self-absorbed prejudices than the Irish countrywoman he is denigrating. Meanwhile, his use of the past participle saved is notable for its convenient passive tense and omission of who has done the saving. It is presumably the nurse herself who has principally facilitated Frankenstein's return to functioning consciousness, and so perhaps should be given more license for frank, unfeeling words. Not so for Victor, whose narrative repeatedly shows signs of a remarkable self-absorption. Here, he must be the victim. He must be pitied, in spite of the fact both the reader and the nurse, in different ways, have good reason to condemn him for past actions which have had devastating consequences. There are more obvious examples of Frankenstein's pathetic self-absorption. How about his extraordinary claim in Chapter 8 of Volume 1 that his suffering exceeds Justine's, an innocent victim of his egocentric, unnatural machinations, and someone who is shortly to be condemned to death for a crime she didn't commit? He blubs self-indulgently, "The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold." Do not be taken in, as Walton unquestionably is, by Victor's use of melodramatic, extravagant imagery. The metaphor fangs of remorse is an ornate attempt to dress up his feelings of regret within an image of some kind of wild dog with teeth snapping repeatedly away at his heart to punish past presumption. However, behind the imagery and the emotive language lies the brutal reality that a dear, loyal friend of the family is about to be sentenced to death because he gave life to a creature which he subsequently totally ignored and abhorred without any thought of the potential consequences. Another example of Frankenstein's egocentricity can be seen in his frequent references to his long-expected marriage to saintly Elizabeth. In Chapter 1 of Volume 3, referring to his plan to create a female partner for his monster, he reflects, "I must perform my engagement and let the monster depart with his mate before I allowed myself to enjoy the delight of a union from which I expected peace." Note the implicit arrogance of Elizabeth's omission from the sentence structure. It is not the first person plural, we, or, dare I even suggest it, the third person singular, she, which is deemed relevant here, but just repeated, I. It is Frankenstein who must allow himself to anticipate future delight and peace within a marriage with another person. Whether that person will also be similarly enchanted is not directly considered, or even worse, just assumed. Why would a life with a man who has absented himself for a number of years to play with dead body parts before legging it from a particularly successful compilation of dead body parts not be one of endless happiness and bliss? But of course, a degree of self-confidence and self-belief is important for both personal happiness and success within both our world and that of the early 19th century. However, what makes Frankenstein's arrogance so unpalatable is that it often results in him abdicating responsibility for his actions. Yes, there is the occasional, self-indulgent, metaphorical self-flagellation. There is no reason not to believe him or play down his suffering when, for example, in Chapter 1 of Volume 2, he reveals he considered suicide following the deaths of Justine and William. Often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. However, beneath these occasional melodramatic pronouncements lies a deeply unpleasant narcissism, summed up perfectly within the breathtakingly arrogant lines from Chapter 2 of Volume 3, "I was formed for peaceful happiness, but I am a blasted tree, the bolt has entered my soul." In other words, he feels he was made for a wonderful life of ease and contentment. This was his entitlement, and the fact that the majority of his fellow human beings have to toil and struggle, achieving happiness only intermittently, is of no concern to him. He was formed for happiness, and my goodness, how dreadful it is that he didn't end up with a life of minute-by-minute ease and contentment. But just as his earlier metaphor in Chapter 8 of Volume 1 about fangs of remorse can sidetrack the less discerning reader into sympathy, when simple facts indicate that this should be almost exclusively directed towards Justine, so here his imagery of a blasted tree is similarly disingenuous. It suggests falsely that he is an entirely natural part of creation, but one which has been wrecked by a metaphorical bolt of lightning in a way which never could have been predicted or foreseen. The implied passivity and lack of responsibility within this image is so misleading. Frankenstein himself made the decision to wrench himself away from his family and from nature by spending years holed up on his own within a disgusting, dirty, dead body-lined laboratory. It was not an outside force, such as a bolt of lightning, which caused his moral and spiritual ruin, but his own obsessive arrogance and assumption. To state the obvious, trees cannot blast themselves, and so Frankenstein's image sums up one of his key character flaws: his inability to take genuine responsibility for the consequences of his past actions, and to persist in painting himself as a helpless victim worthy of our sympathy. Victor's dying words confirm the impression of him as an unpleasant, smug individual who, ironically, doesn't appear to have learned a great deal from his experiences, even though he is desperate for Walton to do so. Reflecting on his past actions, he sums up, "I created a rational creature, and was bound towards him to assure, as far as was in my power, his happiness and well-being. This was my duty, but there was another still paramount to that. My duties towards the beings of my own species had greater claims to my attention, because they included a greater proportion of happiness or misery. Urged by this view, I refused, and I did right in refusing, to create a companion for the first creature." This is simply yet another classic Frankenstein dodge, in which yet again he is not prepared to accept responsibility for his own failings. On the one hand, he seemed to suggest, perhaps for the first time, that he had a duty to assure the happiness and well-being of his creation. Yet he attempts to justify his failure to do this by claiming, pompously, that his duties towards the being of my own species had to take precedence. How should we interpret these duties? Based on his subsequent reference to his refusal to create a female monster, it implies that his duty, first and foremost as a human being with the ability to create, was to ensure the protection and well-being of his fellow human beings. This spurious, equivocatory argument spectacularly misses the point, which is that surely by following up on his duty to the monster by giving him a modicum of attention, all of the subsequent difficulties might have been avoided. If he had made a reasonable attempt to ensure the creature's happiness from the beginning of his life, as was the case with his own parents, then the likelihood is that he wouldn't need it to have focused on discharging his duties to protect his fellow human beings, because the creature would not have felt so tortuously isolated, and so may well not have ended up showing, in his words, unparalleled malignity and selfishness. As well as being disgustingly quick to judge and look down upon others, egocentric, and unable or unwilling to take genuine responsibility for the consequences of his actions, Victor often seems somewhat naive and even stupid. In Geneva with his family, following his epic encounter with the monster in the Alps, which resulted in his agreement to create a second monster, Victor manages to achieve a degree of mental repose. He speculates about the happy effects of the monster disappearing to South America with his mate, never to be seen or heard of again, at least within privileged Western Europe, and even wonders, or so my fond fancy imagined, some accident might meanwhile occur to destroy him and put an end to my slavery forever. As is typical within Frankenstein's skewed narrative, we can see him positioning himself self-pityingly as the victim. Helpless passivity is implied within the suggestion that he is in slavery, even though this so-called slave previously displayed an astonishing superhuman amount of agency to create life. However, his hope that somehow an 8-foot creature with proportionately supercharged strength, already seen at this stage in the novel through his instant strangling of William and his successful battling against a current within a rapid stream to save the life of a young girl, may somehow get killed within some unspecified accident, is, to say the very least, wishful thinking. However, his naivety cum stupidity in chapter 6 of volume 3 has far more deadly consequences. knowing that the monster has ominously vowed to be with him on his wedding night. He assumes that the monster's only aim will be to attack or kill himself, even though by this stage in the novel the same monster has killed William, Clerval and framed their devoted friend of the family, Justine. So, on his wedding night, he leaves his panting new wife alone. I reflected how fearful the combat which I momentarily expected would be to my wife, and I earnestly entreated her to retire, resolving not to join her until I had obtained some knowledge as to the situation of my enemy. Sure enough, soon after patrolling various passages within the house, he hears a scream, signifying that the monster has secured another victim, and thus continued his plan to gain revenge on his negligence of his most basic of duties, master. The reader is left to scream. Why on earth did he not realise that Elizabeth's life was in danger? On the one hand, we must assume that, at least in terms of practical, commonsensical intelligence, he is not as bright as he thinks he is. When younger, he believed himself destined for some great enterprise. However, it is also likely that his egocentrism, his tendency to see the world uniquely in relation to himself, with himself not just in the middle of his vision, but to the left, right, in front and behind, has blinded him to logical, highly probable scenarios which more balanced, more human individuals would have identified immediately. For whether you assign it to his naivety or to his me perspective on the world, there is no doubt that Victor fails spectacularly when it comes to protecting his friends and family. On the one hand, when with Clerval in the Lake District worrying about whether the fiend is following him, he would not quit Henry for a moment, but followed him as his shadow to protect him from the fancied rage of his destroyer. Yet, given the impracticalities of a ceaseless vigil over a group of people who don't all live together, it is surely his failure to tell his loved one about his creation which ultimately leaves them so vulnerable and unprepared for their deeply unpleasant deaths. Yes, having such a conversation would be difficult and problematic, and unlike when revealing nearly all to Walton, he would not have had the advantage of a wild setting to make a wild story seem more probable. However, it would at least have put his loved ones on red alert, as well as help provide further insights into seemingly erratic, occasionally mad behaviour. In Chapter 5 of Volume 3, Victor explains why he never told his loved ones about his creation. I had a persuasion that I should be supposed mad, and this in itself would forever have chained my tongue. But besides, I could not bring myself to disclose a secret which would fill my hearer with consternation and make fear and unnatural horror the inmates of his breast. So, entirely predictably, his first reason relates back to his own preoccupation with himself, in particular how he is perceived by others. As for the second, there is no doubt that Elizabeth, Henry, his father and co. would have been horrified and scared to hear that a vengeful 8-foot monster composed of dead body parts was on the loose and quite possibly coming to get them. But at least it would have given them the chance to take some kind of precautions to preserve their precarious existences.
Through her portrayal of the character of Victor Frankenstein, Shelley shows the dangers of arrogant male presumption and the unhealthiness of excess, whether that is excessive study or far too much time spent within self-imposed, isolated exile. Through the evolution of the creature, from potentially benign to monstrous, she shows the potential consequences of parental neglect and loathing. Who knows how the monster would have turned out had Frankenstein not instantly propelled himself away from him, sickened by the fruits of his own hands. Finally, Shelley also shows the perils of a failure to communicate openly with those you love. In Victor Frankenstein's case, it results in tragedies which arguably could have been avoided or at least deferred. Let's now look at Shelley's portrayal of the monster. And actually, I'm not totally happy using this term, taken as it is from Victor's biased narrative. Perhaps in order to allow for a more balanced perspective, let's use the term creature.
Well, On a physical level, there's universal acceptance of its horrific appearance, which incidentally was totally unintended by its creator, who had selected his features as beautiful. Towards the very end of the novel, Walton meets the creature on board his ship in the North Pole. Seeing him hovering and mourning over the dead body of Victor, he finds that he cannot find words to describe. Gigantic in stature, yet uncouth and distorted in its proportions. As he hung over the coffin, his face was concealed by long locks of ragged hair, but one vast hand was extended, in colour and apparent texture like that of a mummy. Such an account contradicts Victor's initial claim that his creature's limbs were in proportion, although it is unclear as to whether this was just his original intention or whether he continued to hold this view when surveying his living final product. The overall impression is of a wild, chaotic, huge creature with a horrible, decayed, death-like brown skin colour. Terrified reactions to innocuous or even benign life-saving actions on the part of the creature, such as saving a young girl from a roaring stream, or introducing himself to a blind father, confirm that there is indeed something initially repulsive and deeply unsettling about his appearance, and repulsive for everyone, not just Victor, who is of course particularly easily repulsed. However, whilst clearly emphasising its unsettling appearance, Shelley seems to draw parallels between the creature's earliest movements and that of a human baby, which has the effect of making the reader question the legitimacy and morality of Frankenstein's reactions. In Volume 1, Chapter 5, Frankenstein tells of presumably Agog Walton about the creature's earliest actions. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. Imagine, if you will, reading the lines on screen out of context, only knowing that the he is newly born, newly brought to life. Wouldn't this leave us, at the very least, to challenge the behaviour and language of the first-person narrator? Although newborn babies can see objects and colours from the very beginning of their lives, they can only see objects that are 8 to 15 inches away. Faced with a large object in the near distance, is there any wonder that the creature's eyes focus on him, though probably without being able to figure out who or what he is? References to muttering some inarticulate sounds and a grin wrinkling his cheeks need to be challenged similarly. Both phrases have negative connotations. The verb mutter seems dismissive in tone of the creature's attempt to speak, and of course a newborn, or a new to life, is not going to be able to use articulate language at the age of a few hours. Meanwhile, the noun grin, rather than smile or laugh, particularly given it is followed by wrinkled, seems to suggest a smile which is too wide, perhaps even masking hidden malice. Finally, how about the reference to a hand being stretched out, seemingly to detain? Surely a newborn or a new to life stretching out arms to a parent or creator, or just any adult present, is a natural call for affection and protection. Any parent suggesting that a newborn's intention is to detain and or inconvenience would quite rightly be dismissed as deeply selfish and perverse. And so, a close reading of the lines on screen forces us to challenge Frankenstein's self-justifying narrative, and results in feelings of sympathy for a creature who, although clearly unpleasant to the eye, may just be desperately trying to engage and bond with a parent figure. But of course, it is not only newborns who are vulnerable, propelled into strange and, especially in the creature's case, hostile environments. In the early months of the creature's life, he has to make his own way in the world and independently discover things which, if he had been a natural human, or indeed any other natural species, would have been taught to him by a parent figure. In Chapter 3 of Volume 2, when talking to Frankenstein, who of course relays the entire narrative to Walton and later added some life and detail to the latter's notes, the creature is initially thrilled to discover fire. In my joy I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. In any conventional human or other living species setup, a parent would be on hand to educate the child about fire, to warn them of its dangers, and, if the worst happened, comfort and soothe. The creature has no such basic network, which seems all the more unfair and tragic when, here and in other places of the novel, he comes across as so thoughtful and sensitive. He is right and perceptive to point out the ironic incongruity of a single source, fire, producing both the wonderful joy of warmth and, if you get too close, the sharp pain of burning. These reflections paint the creature as clearly a sentient, intelligent being, and this is similarly seen in his appreciation of the beauty of nature, something Victor also appreciates when he isn't obsessively holed up inside, collating and rejigging body parts. In the same chapter, he refers to the beauty of the moon, and has the discernment to note, "I found that the sparrow uttered none but harsh notes, whilst those of the blackbird and thrush were sweet and enticing." These are not the words you would expect from either Victor's own description of the monster, or popular stereotypes stemming from the numerous inaccurate film productions of the novel, but rather the language of a sensitive, poetic soul, who evidently has the inner potential to live a peaceful life, provided the society within which he lives is able to overlook external hideousness, something which, by the end of the novel, has been shown to be impossible. And indeed, as you can tell by listening to the bird's sounds, his judgment is clearly, and do excuse the pun, sound. The sparrow's notes are harsher and less melodic than those emitted by blackbirds and thrushes. And indeed, what is ironic about the extraordinary exchange between the creature and Victor within the Alps is that, for a great deal of the time, the former seems far more civilized than the latter. The creature is regularly able to use reason far more effectively than his apparently superior human creator, as the comparison on screen makes abundantly clear. "My rage was without bounds, I sprang on him," versus, "Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee." One creature is unable to control his emotions and resorts to senseless attempted attack. The other uses reasoned argument and exhibits self-control. The effect of Shelley's role reversal here is to emphasise the ludicrousness and unfairness of Victor's portrayal of his creation. At different points of the novel, he refers to him as devil, fiend, monster, and even, hilariously, vile insect. At times, especially during this encounter in the Alps, it is Victor who seems more monstrous and uncivilized, thus making it harder to come to a simple conclusion about how we as readers should react to these two characters. For Shelley makes it even harder for the reader to determine where we stand in relation to Victor and the monster, and the extent to which we assign blame or responsibility to each of them by blurring the boundaries between them. This is something Jeanette Winterson plays with and extends in her 2019 novel Frankenstein, based on and inspired by Mary Shelley's novel. Frankenstein has multiple narratives, including the story of transsexual Dr. Ry Shelley, who falls in love with Victor Stein, and that of Mary Shelley herself in the 19th century, leading up towards writing her famous novel. In a section within a madhouse entitled Bedlam 3, Winterson even has Victor directly addressing his author, refuting the separation between himself and the monster, or at least reassigning their roles. "You have appeared in the pages of a novel," Mary Shelley said. "You and the monster you created." "I am the monster you created," said Victor Frankenstein. "I am the thing that cannot die, and I cannot die because I have never lived." The original novel clearly doesn't go that far. Mary Shelley doesn't decide at any point to put herself directly in as a character. But there are times when lines and descriptions would seem to fit equally well for either creator or created. For instance, from the lines on screen, can you identify which one refers to Victor and which to the creature? Now have a go at this one. Which one refers to Victor and which to the creature? As it happens in both examples, the first one is uttered by or describes Victor, whilst the second is spoken by the monster. However, it could easily have been the other way round, and this is the point. Shelley wants to challenge Victor's, and perhaps humans in general, assumption of superiority and moral outrage. She wants to challenge the existence of essential, clear-cut differences between the two. The longer the novel goes on, the harder it gets for the reader to placidly accept Victor's view that his creation is a malignant abomination, and this is in spite of the fact that the longer the novel goes on, the greater the numbers killed by the creature. As we read, we observe the role reversals, in which the creature seems so much more civilized and eloquent than the human. We see both of them expressing their love for nature, yet when thinking of the other, gnashing their teeth and getting angry. We note their appetites for learning, albeit in different fields, and the fact that during their formative years they were largely self-taught. And, in Walton's fourth letter to his sister, as well as the closing stages of the novel, the same time period, we see them all consumed and solely focused on the other. Thus we must conclude that Shelley's portrayal of the monster is unquestionably ambivalent. Yes, he succumbs to appalling violence and at times revels, albeit in crazy short bursts, in the deaths of Victor's loved ones. But it is difficult to forget or understate the potential effect of his extraordinarily isolated position within the world, and Victor's total failure to provide any kind of nurturing or parenting whatsoever. Nowadays, all parents understand the vital importance of responding actively to a newborn's calls and actions. According to attachment theory, babies and toddlers who are repeatedly ignored are more likely to experience long-term difficulties with their social and emotional interactions. Put within this context, it is impossible for the reader not to sympathise with the creature for having his smiles, coos and arm stretches, albeit ones us humans are likely to see as grotesque given the creature's size and body formation, so utterly neglected and despised. The creature, like Victor, clearly has the potential for good, as seen in his noble, persuasive speeches in the Alps, his appreciation of nature, and his almost extraordinary success with his self-education. The overall feeling at the end of the novel is almost like that experienced at the end of a Shakespearean tragedy. So much death, so much waste, with a significant proportion being due to the fatal flaws of the so-called hero. One can't help but think this could all so easily have been avoided.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the character of Victor Frankenstein and the creature in Mary Shelley's classic novel. Many thanks for watching.